Hey guys, how's it going? We're back with another episode of Deck Doctor. Yeah, that's right. You remember when I used to do this show? Well, it's back. So the rules are pretty simple. I make a tweet like this one, and a lot of you guys respond. I look through all the responses, all the decks, all the ideas, and I pick one that ends up, I think, being kind of perfect for something that I think I want to refine, to talk about deck building more in terms of, how deck building can apply to all decks. The reason I want to do this is because I want to teach you guys more about how the specific methodology and the logic behind the deck building works, because it is very complicated, and you guys have said you really liked it when I do kind of like guides on deck building and that kind of thing. So it's great to be able to see some examples of deck building in process. All right, this week we have the deck concept from LoR Decks and Gameplay, and this is their deck. It is Fearsome attackers basically using the minus attack things that Shurima offers, such as Spirit Fire, Raz Bloodmane, Scrying Sands, Exhaust, etc. So we create a nice Fearsome's, oh yeah, and of course Quicksand. So a Fearsome's archetype where you're just combining Shurima's minus attack with the ability to effectively just not get blocked that Shadow Isles cards have. Yeah, I said that real smoothly. So it's a pretty cool concept, and it makes a lot more sense than iterations in the past, because of course, Fearsome Shurima has been around, but Merciless Hunter elevates it to an entirely new level. So the first things first, I'm going to give you guys a brief rundown of, some of the specific cards and, what kinds of changes we might be considering. We'll jump into one game before making any changes whatsoever, and just talk about, the positions that different cards are going to be in. Right? So the things I notice about this deck initially are that it's running a little bit of a slower game plan than I would probably like for a Fearsome's deck. In particular, the fact that we're running Callista over Elise, I think is probably going to end up being a little bit too slow. Spirit Fire might end up being cute as a one-of. You can use this on an open attack to push damage or defensively. Raz Bloodmane might end up a bit of a meta call, but I think this card is a little bit too slow. There's a lot of ways you can push damage with Fearsomes, and Aether Fiend in particular is probably a little too clunky for this deck. Apart from that, it looks pretty standard. Oh, another thing is a lot of Fearsome decks, like, back when we actually had, Fearsome decks with Harrowing and stuff, a lot of them weren't actually running Glimpse for favor of Stalking Shadows. So that's a change that I'm considering as well. It's really important to, while you're in the deck builder, get an idea for the cards that you're considering adding to the list so that you can spot count while you're in game. Spot counting is the most fundamental kind of like strategy in deck building, which is just looking at any sort of position and thinking, okay, do I want X card here? So just think about the certain cards that you might want to be adding to this list. For example, Dune Keeper is, I think, going to be a really powerful card in this deck, so I might want to try that after this game. And a second card is probably Ruin Runner. I think would end up fitting well into this kind of playstyle, especially since we don't really have anything on 5. And those are powerful cards that I'm thinking about adding, so maybe I'll be considering them in every position, right? So just ask yourself, in any given move, how would I feel about this card if it was in my hand right now, right? It's important not to just tunnel vision and only look at the cards that are in your hand, because the positions are going to be irrelevant of the hand states, right? They're just two unrelated factors. Okay. And yep, I think that about covers my initial thoughts on this list. Oh, by the way, I don't mind the Nocturne. I think that a lot of people might look at Nocturne in kind of like a weird way here, because, he's traditionally going to be a Nightfall champion, and he'll never level up in this deck. We don't have enough Nightfalls, but in a full Fearsome deck, think of him like a kind of slightly weaker Frenzied Skitterer, and if you've ever played Fearsome or played against them, you know that how incredibly crucial this card is for them. So you're running Nocturne not as a way to level up or, give Fearsome to things, but just as a way to minus attack things and give one vulnerable for a big attack. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into our first game here, and this is going to be Lysandra Shurima, no second champion. It'll be a Frostguard Thrall deck. All right, and we have some Callistas out the bat. I mentioned I was thinking about running Elise over Callista. Callista is a little bit awkward of a champion. Get a little bit more in depth about that later. I'm actually pretty happy to run Merciless Hunter here in my opener. This is a deck that, even though it's an aggressive deck, we do have a lot of kind of like slower cards. We're not really going super deep for one drops like, more traditional aggro decks. And as you see, he's got Lysandra and he's got the attack token on odds, which means he's going to have first action on turn 3, which means my turn 3 follow-up 2 turns from now can be Merciless Hunter. It's important to be looking at the attack token when you're thinking about your mulligan, because you really have to be planning the turns out in your head. Okay. And we can go ahead and pass here. A little bit of a slow start. I'd like to be able to start dealing chip damage with Stygian, but it's okay. All right, let's see if he drops the Lysandra, and there she is. So this is the Merciless Hunter we kept on turn 1. And being able to deal with that is potentially nice in this deck. It depends a little bit on, you know, exactly what we want. Ooh, that second Stygian is dangerous. So something in the hand here that's pretty awkward is this Rite of Negation. I might want to replace this for something else. We'll see. Because it's really important to be able to use our cards proactively. Like, we need activators for these, otherwise we're gonna have a really awkward time. We want to be able to set up 2 turns from now, potentially doing a big Skitterer. I think I might actually, as bizarre as this is, I might just play Nocturne without triggering his Nightfall. The weird thing about this position is we're not really going to need Nocturne's Nightfall right now, and in this kind of hand state, it's kind of awkward playing him as a 4/5/3. Oh, that's fine. And we can actually just stop that as a blocker by exhausting here. He actually played it as a Fearsome blocker, but overhealed his Nexus, so we're kind of effectively dealing the same amount of damage anyway. I think this is perfectly fine. I'm going to try to take a pretty aggressive line. And I think in this case, I'll actually just try to go through the Lysandra instead of dragging her. Because we have potential for a turn 6 kill. So if you see the line here, you know, we're going to have exactly... Oh, that's dangerous. Fading Memories is very, very dangerous there. Okay, perfect. And we've got, yeah, 1 Skitterer to be able to play out. So we'll play the first Skitterer now. I don't think he really had an attack here, so that's fine. And we just want to make sure that we are going wide on this. Good. So now we can go ahead and, you know, set up our kill. It looks like we're going for a second Skitterer, and then probably potentially triple Stygian. He might Avalanche after the first Skitterer. Let's see what he does after this. But yeah, this is why we didn't really mind not killing the Kindly before, because we knew we were just going to attack through it on turn 4, and we knew we were going to Skitterer on turn 6 this turn and attack through it again. So he's thinking about turbo flipping a Thrall here. If he whiffs and is unable to flip Thrall, he will lose the game on the spot. A lot of hands are actually forced to Avalanche. If he's running Avalanche right now, he'll have to do it to kill my 2 Skitterers, and then I'll literally triple Stygian and probably win the game off of that. Preservationist will actually flip that super fast. So he actually has 3 Fearsome blockers at this point. Gives me a couple of options, and I do have Scrying Sands to be able to delete one of the blockers. I can choose whether to play the double Onlooker hands or the single Skitterer and remove one of the blockers. Onlooker's actually looking a little bit worse than Skitterer because it doesn't... I basically don't have enough board space for it, right? So there's a little bit less of an upside. Let's just go for the fading on the Skitterer, and then we'll delete the last Fearsome blocker in Preservationists with Scrying Sands. And this should be lethal against any hand you could have. Okay, pretty straightforward. I don't think it matters what we grab there whatsoever. So this is Fearsomes and how they play out, right? It is a kind of slower version of aggro that is sort of looking for usually a combo kill in the mid game. You kind of have to plan your turns out, and you need to make sure that, you know, you're thinking ahead and setting up your combo pieces. So just to clarify, I would never recommend as a deck builder, you know, trying to just make changes after playing a deck a single time. In this case, Fearsomes is a deck that I'm actually very comfortable on. I've played a lot of Fearsomes in the past, and it's an archetype that, even though this one is using some of the Shurima cards, is actually pretty standard and like gonna play very similarly to how Fearsomes has been executed in the past. So a couple of changes we're going to make right off the bat. We're going to want to make this strategy a little bit more proactive. I can initially cut the Aether Fiend and 1 Rite of Negation. That's pretty easy to do. And I'll also be cutting down on the Callistas. The big thing with Callista that's really weird, Callista is kind of an awkward card, especially now that we have a lot of 3 mana plays that she's competing with. Callista is a bizarre card. I think she's pretty overrated as a champion. She has almost never been competitive. She's used in one deck, which is They Who Endure, at basically one point in the meta, and the reason she was used in They Who Endure at that time was effectively to be able to punish board sweepers into your Blighted Caretaker, mostly, for example, like TF red card. The thing about Kalista that's really awkward is she's going to have a really hard time leveling, because you want to be attacking, you don't want to be leaving her back, and the opponent can block her. She's going to have a pretty hard time getting payoff on her level up because, you know, by the time she levels up, you know, when she actually starts swinging, you revive the ephemeral copy of an ally, but the only problem with that is at the point that that's happening, the opponent can just block Kalista and then stop both attacks. In this deck, they might not be able to, but we should assume the opponent has at least 1 or 2 units able to block Fearsomes, because if they don't, then we're winning the game anyway, right? So Kalista's sort of like an aggro enabler card, but with a mid-range payoff, and she's playing at 2 very different speeds because of that. So ultimately, I think a little bit weak. Additionally, Kalista's champ spell is Black Spear, which is a much slower card than this deck probably wants to play at. So I'm thinking, oh yeah, and by the way, I don't want Black Spear in here either. I think Elise would end up being a little bit better. Elise is really nice because now that we have Merciless Hunter added to this archetype and Frenzied Skitterer, our 3-mana slots are tight. You'll see, like, did you see last game where we played Merciless Hunter on 3 and, you know, on 6 we did a double Skitterer play? That sort of thing is going to happen a lot. It's harder to find space for a Kalista. Elise is sweet. The spiders she summons are kind of free, but most importantly, when we're doing the Skitterer turns, at least we'll just get free plus attack from Skitterer because of her spider tag. She's not going to level very easily in this deck because we don't have house spider or anything, but her spider tag and her ability is worth more than enough. I actually really like the ratioing of 2 Nocturne here. Nocturne is a really nice additional copy of something like Frenzied Skitterer. It will be cute sometimes. You'll see, you know, games like the one we just played, it's actually totally fine to just play Nocturne on turn 4 sometimes. It's really not the worst thing ever. So I'm fine with that. Doesn't feel great to double draw, and it's pretty redundant with Skitterer, so 2 is a good ratio. And I'll actually add in back 1 Kalista for the champ slot, just because we do need, you know, an additional source of proactive, fearsome tempo plays. You shouldn't really feel super obligated to use all of your champ slots. I mean, I definitely might end up taking the Kalista back out, but I don't really mind her as a one of. I mean, I have no problem with running 7 3-drops, and if I'm not double drawing her for Black Spear, it's not too bad. In terms of what we want to do with some of the early cards for this deck, well, I think a 3rd Fading Memories is absolutely essential, especially if we want to run Nocturne. This card is going to help enable the Nocturne, and most importantly, it's going to push a lot of damage with Onlooker, and in a sort of Fearsome or Spiders list, Frenzied Skitterer is just completely the core of your strategy. We're going to find ourselves using Fading Memories on Skitterer a lot. That last game is the perfect example of Fading Memories. I mean, we could have played it in a few different ways, but if he had killed some of the units on our board, the triple Stygian Onlooker play that we could have done as the finisher there with the Fading would have been really good. We chose to Fading Skitterer, but that's just part of the power of Fading's flexibility. And as I mentioned, I also think Ruin Runner will end up being really good in this deck. So Ruin Runner is an interesting card. Obviously, it's not fearsome, so it won't be able to gain as much value. Sometimes the opponent will be able to block it, but it's still a very powerful card that plays well for the speed of this deck. We don't really have anything else necessarily happening on turn 5. It's really hard for the opponent to deal with, and it will always get damage in. Additionally, Ruin Runner and Fearsomes have a large overlap in terms of what they're trying to do, effectively devalue chump blockers on the opponent's side. When you look at the Fearsome keyword, the whole point of Fearsomes is to take the opponent cards, those being like, you know, 1/1 blockers, these tiny blockers, and basically say, I'm not going to let these cards ever get value this game, right? And so it's important that we're not running a lot of non-Fearsomes. Otherwise, we would be giving those cards a way to get value, right? Like, for example, if I was to run, I don't know, no, not this one. Bakai Sandspinner. If I was to run Bakai Sandspinner in this deck, a vanilla stat line without a keyword, 4/5/3. Well, I could drag something with his own vulnerable, but if I'm not dragging something with him, then he'll just get blocked by a unit that is unable to block otherwise, right? And won't deal any damage. That's not useful. And I'm basically, by adding non-Fearsomes to the deck, I would be giving value to the chump blockers and defeating the entire point of being a fearsome deck. But even though Ruin Runner doesn't have Fearsome, the fact that she's Overwhelm will often be overlapping in the same exact way. A lot of the times, the opponent will be able to block with, you know, a 1/1 or a 2 health unit or something like that. But they'll still be taking a lot of damage to Ruin Runner, so it ends up fitting the deck perfectly fine. It can be important in that way to think about deck building in terms of what kinds of opponent's cards you're planning on devaluing. When you think about it, that's kind of what every deck is trying to do, right? Like a Fearsome deck is trying to devalue chump blockers, right? A control deck is trying to devalue the opponent's burn tools by just healing and staying alive, right? An aggro deck is trying to devalue any sort of top end by killing the opponent before they have the ability to play it, right? And it's important to make sure that you're not accidentally running units that are giving those things value, because then you're defeating the purpose of your archetype. In this case, I think Raz Bloodmane is a good example of this being a little bit too slow. A large part of the way this deck wins is, yeah, through one of these combo finishers, but as a Fearsome deck, we are going to want to kill pretty fast. I don't mind harrowing. It's a bit of a meta call. It's a good, bailout for when the opponent has stabilized your board. So it's okay to have something like that. But Raz will end up, I think, just being a little bit too slow and kind of redundant, because on the turns where, even if we want to develop into turn 7 to kill the opponent, I think we should likely have stuff like double skitterer hands and stuff that will be able to still do the same thing but better. I also mentioned that I think Dunekeeper would be super important in this list. And the reason for that is, well, a few things. It's a really powerful, aggressive card. It has some utility in terms of being able to block. But one of the things this list will do a lot is we have sources of vulnerable, right? Merciless Hunter as well as even Exhaust can give something vulnerable. And vulnerable is a different way of getting around Fearsome blockers, right? If the opponent has a single Fearsome blocker, we need to make them vulnerable, and then to be able to remove them from combat, it pays to have a very cheap little non-Fearsome unit so that we can neutralize their Fearsome blocker with our, otherwise just cheap unit. And both the Dunekeeper and its Ephemeral Sand Soldier will be great at doing that. And to be able to fit it in, let's go ahead and take out the glimpses and a little bit of the top end. I cut one Rite of Negation initially, but I'm not really going to need the second one here. This is a strategy that I don't think is going to worry that much about slow speed spells at expensive mana points. For the most part, we're very aggressive, and aggressive strategies don't really need to worry about denying stuff with Rite of Negation. Avalanche is kind of the big thing, but we'll be playing around Avalanche in a lot of different ways and shouldn't need a reactive spell like that. That might just get blanked in our hand. We really do want to play this more aggressively than anything else. I can keep this Spiritfire and Harrowing for now. I'm a little concerned that we might have a little bit too much in the Exhaust and Scrying Sands. So let's go ahead and I'll go 2 and 2 for now. I'll run 2 of the Stalking Shadows. I mentioned that I was thinking about running this card over Glimpse. And Stalking Shadows, of course, is nice with Stygian Onlooker. It's nice with Frenzied Skitterer. Sometimes we can even pull Ruin Runner out of it for some damage. But this should be a pretty big improvement in, I think, most aspects. I'm fine with the rest of these changes for now. And let's go ahead and take this out for another game. Okay, get into our second game against Azir Aurelia. And look at this. This is actually one of the matchups why I sped up the deck. It's kind of important to go fast against this. Azir Aurelia is a very combo-centric deck. So in this case, we have a pretty interesting hand attacking on odds. I'm actually pretty happy keeping Stygian, Elise, and Merciless. Stygian we're not really going to be able to play on turn 1 here, but it's okay because we can use it pretty early for some chip damage, depending on, the curve. There will be a time to play it. It's Quicksand. Quicksand might end up being a little slow here, and that's an interesting draw. There's Dunekeeper, which just has the ability to pretty freely just get in chip here. This looks really great. Great spot for Dunekeeper. We really love just being able to deal this 4 right away. And his deck, if they play Dancing Droplet or Sparring Student, neither of those can really afford to block this. So it's just a great way to deal 4 damage in. And that also leaves the Dunekeeper as the unit on our board. This is what I was kind of referring to when I was talking about the vulnerable combo, which we'll see if this ends up mattering. But in this case, if I, make a Fearsome blocker vulnerable with a card like Merciless Hunter, then I can drag it away with Dunekeeper, which is great value. So Elise might be able to block some damage down for free here. It's actually probably worth her health. Because she's Fearsome and he doesn't really have a lot of Fearsome blockers, her health is probably kind of useful for nothing except for blocking these 1/1s and saving a bit of Nexus health. Blocking the Sand Soldiers is kind of nice. I mean, you can't always do it, but when you can, you're kind of like saving 1 health because of the Nexus Strike ability. Got a second Elise. It's not going to be super useful here. And right now we're noticing that these quicksands are pretty bricky in our hand. This is going to be the case quite a bit. I think this card might end up being a little too slow for this deck. Really might need a more proactive opener. I think in this case, just opening with Merciless Hunter is fine, just because we have first action, so we have to. I'd love to be able to save this for a little bit later if we had some kind of like Stygian onlooker hands, but unfortunately, no real way to take an activation here. That's interesting. I don't mind just, you know, trying to drag this with the Dunekeeper. Don't think it's really going to change too much.
Skitter out from the darkness.
Yep. And his pass pretty much kind of telegraphs the retreat return. Okay, so we've got him in a decent position here. I mean, this is kind of everything this deck wanted to do. Our Dunekeeper did some damage early. We've got Fearsomes on the board, and his deck doesn't really have good counters to Fearsomes. And then we've got Onlooker in hand, so on our turn 5, we actually have pretty good odds of just going in for the kill. Quicksand will be a really adorable trick to potentially be able to push damage on turn 5. Ooh, Dunekeeper's not bad here.
Rhythm takes hold. There was no time for fear.
Okay. So yeah, we're going to be tanking some damage from this duo, unless we want to do a Quicksand block on it, which I wouldn't necessarily mind.
What's your hurry?
Okay, so we're going to see what his attack is here. We've got a few options, but it's pretty likely we'll go in for a Crawling Sensation as well. And he goes ahead and attacks with the Blossoming Blade as well, one of his potential fearsome blockers. So a few things we can do here. I will need to, you know, get the Green Glade duo out of the way for next turn anyway, and I think the best way to be able to be fine doing that is just taking the Quicksand now and blocking down while summoning the Crawling Sensation for the spiders next turn. Looks really good. So let's just go ahead and do that. At 1 mana, he's not really going to have much of a response here. We did need to trade this down anyway, so it's perfectly fine, and we're getting a free block here because, again, our unit's health doesn't matter. So, basically, we are going to play for the Elise level up here. It's fairly niche. You're not always going to be able to do this in this deck, but when it happens, it can be pretty free. Oh, he surrendered. So, the play next turn was going to be Quicksand into Onlooker, potentially top deck, and we have really, really good ability to just lethal him out there, especially with the leveled Elise giving the little spiders Fearsome to push more damage. Okay, so the changes worked pretty well. That was really nice. We now have the ability to kind of like go a little bit more aggressive, but it's still a little bit too reactive. Ultimately, Fearsomes is a deck that kind of needs to be very proactive. You can run a game plan that slows down a little bit. There's nothing wrong with going deeper into stuff like Stalking Shadows. There's nothing wrong with maybe, you know, Harrowing style. That could be fine. It's not necessarily that the deck needs to be fast per se, it just needs to be able to use its cards proactively. Cards like Quicksand, Exhaust, and Scrying Sands, we're going to have to cut down this concept because it's just mostly cards that we're only going to be able to get real use out of on the final swing turn. We can't even really set up our combo with them. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these options. I think out of the weaker ones, Quicksand is probably the first one to go. I think it ends up being a little bit overkill, and I do like the ability to kind of like cheaply combo kill them with these. It's pretty nice. Scrying Sands versus Exhaust is pretty interesting. Scrying Sands is going to get more value for free because of Predict and the fact that you can use this at flexible speed. Exhaust is going to get a little bit more value in situations where maybe the opponent's attack is too high to even allow your Fearsomes to go through, or in situations where you want to drag one of their units away to specifically get a trigger for something like Bakai Reaper, which actually might matter a lot. But I think for the most part, Scrying Sands is going to be the better tool there. And I don't actually mind going to something like 3 Scrying Sands. Keep in mind, for that role, you know, we're thinking about the amount of cards that we're doing there. In the last game, we were running 2 Scrying Sands, 2 Exhaust, 2 Quicksand, which is a 6 of that specific role, that like finisher kill / flexible trick role. And we couldn't cut down to half, which I think makes it a lot better. I still might cut it down further, but this is still a way to, you know, get a nice amount of value. And I don't mind it as long as we're not running too much of that kind of card. What we're really looking for is, yeah, more combo ability, more proactivity. I think Stalking Shadows might end up being perfectly fine as a 3 if you're, I mean, it's really great when we're hitting Stygian Onlooker or Frenzied Skeeter from that. Merciless Hunter as well. When one of your Merciless Hunters gets Ephemeral, you can just play it and attack it into the other thing. So I'm pretty happy playing the third Stalking Shadows in lieu of, you know, the Glimpse or anything like that. Looks pretty good. And you can also run... Doom Beast is not bad in this kind of deck. Actually, we can quickly go through the options so that I can talk about them. For the most part, we're kind of limited. I wouldn't mind some early one drops. Mark of the Isles is really not bad if we're, you know, worried about the opponent, you know, pinging. If you're playing against a lot of PNZ or something, Mark of the Isles ends up being a pretty great card. I could definitely see that as a one of. I think at that point, Scrying Sands would have to go down to 2, but we can worry about that a little bit later. It's just worth trying out. Ward and Spray is not bad. Just if we want more ways of being able to drag away units. I don't think I need more one drops at this point though. Bakai Reaper, the nice thing about Bakai Reaper is even if you draw it late, you can sometimes just drag a unit away with it with a vulnerable, which is nice because a late Bakai Reaper is sometimes just a one attack unit. But here we can always find value for it. Mask of Mother is pretty adorable. You know, it can give something fearsome. It's a way of being able to, you know, just take the stats and give them value. I'm not 100% sure how much I like Mask of Mother. I mean, it does work pretty well with stuff like Stalking Shadows as well, because it can kind of remove the ephemeral effectively. Definitely a consideration in this list, although we'll have to see. I don't know if I really like the idea of going too tall. I'm fine with trying out the 2 Mask of Mother direction now. That looks pretty good actually. In terms of most other fearsome options, I don't think there's going to be a ton. Doom Beast is really not bad. Definitely a bit of a failsafe that I could come back to in this kind of list. Although, fearsome decks don't necessarily have to run Doom Beast. It's definitely kind of like one of the few Shadow Wells archetypes that has the ability to try to escape it. Rite of Dominance is really adorable. Might be better than Spirit Fire. Spirit Fire allows you to open attack, but ends up costing more mana. And now that we're outside of Quicksand, I don't think the mana point actually really matters too much. So I think the Spirit Fire will end up being a little bit more utility if we end up keeping it. But we'll see. Mostly Fearsomes is an archetype that usually wants to be developing into their attacks more than anything else, kind of committally developing. So ultimately, I think Spiritfire might actually end up having to get cut from this list. So what do I mean by that specifically? Because this is actually something that's really important to understand. So the point of Fearsomes, what you're getting when you're playing Fearsomes is you're devaluing the opponent's blocker, right? Which means you're devaluing their action. Most of the time, you want to be developing with cards like Elusives are kind of the same way because Elusives also can't be blocked by anything. Usually, Fearsomes want to play into their attack turns instead of open attacking because your opponent usually can't get value out of blocking them, right? That's just how Fearsomes work. They are making opponents' blockers less valuable on average. So on average, they're going to be developing into their attacks and getting more value because of it. On top of that, you've also got cards like Frenzied Skitterer as well as Nocturne, right? That are going to be ways of, at slow speed, giving you more value to your attacks as you develop into those attacks. And we've got tools like Stalking Shadows that are going to be getting them more reliably, as well as Fading Memories to like clone multi-skitter returns. That sort of stuff is going to be how you win a lot. Now, here's the thing. So not only is Fearsomes an archetype that wants to develop into their attacks, but they want to develop into their attacks committally. When we think about it, deck building is split into kind of like 2 categories of defensive cards, those being open attack punishers and development punishers, right? So an open attack punisher is going to be a spell that you're playing at fast speed or burst speed, and a development punisher is usually going to be a unit or a slow speed spell. So for example, think like Arachnoid Sentry would be kind of the quintessential development punisher, or some of Targon's spells like Crescent Strike or Avalanche, right? These are examples of development punishers because if you try to develop into an attack turn, those cards will punish you. An open attack punisher is going to be cards like Harsh Winds. Now, these cards are really expensive, but the reason they're priced so high is because they have the ability to interfere with an open attack that would otherwise be locking both players out of mana, right? So when you think about it like that, you usually want to be devaluing one kind of tool or another in this kind of committal deck, right? Now, Fearsomes, like I was saying, you're always going to be developing into your attacks, which means that your opponent is going to be able to use these tools and they'll use them early, right? We can't devalue Arachnoid Sentry. A lot of the times when your opponent is playing Ezreal Draven, you need to be thinking about, okay, I haven't given him Arachnoid Sentry value. You know, I open attacked on turn 4. I open attacked on turn 6. What should I do on turn 8? Well, I haven't let him Arachnoid Sentry me yet. He might still have it. Let me open attack on turn 8 as well. So you can often fall into these patterns where against the control deck, you want to repeat the same, whether you open attacked or whether you developed, you might want to repeat the same thing as you did before because you forced out their answer to that thing already and you haven't forced out their answer to the other thing, right? Think about it like that. So as Fearsomes, on turn 3, on turn 4, on turn 5, we are going to be developing into our attacks no matter what. And our opponent's always going to get to be able to play their development Punisher cards. And as Fearsomes, we want to be able to develop into our attacks. We're not really gaining much value out of the ability to open attack, right? Spirit Fire uniquely gives us the ability to spend our mana and jam an attack and not let the opponent develop a blocker. But this is pretty redundant with the entirety, like the entire point of our deck is that we're already not letting them do that and we're already forcing out their development punishers. So Spirit Fire in this deck ends up just not really making sense. Okay, and in that last spot, well, we can probably go ahead and run Onto Dusk. Onto Dusk is actually a pretty cute way of being able to get reuse value out of Nightfalls. And if we're running Onto Dusk, I think I do like cutting the one Callista for the third Nocturne. The ratios of this are going to be pretty important. For the most part, as this deck wants to find ways of supplementing its late game strategy, you know, curving a little bit later is important. The bigger thing is Onto Dusk, you know, obviously needs something to attach to as a one-of, and it wants to attach to Nightfall. Now, Onto Dusk on Nocturne is a really powerful combo. Just being able to reuse this ability and just give enemies -1 attack this round again is, of course, insane for how this deck wants to finish games. And, of course, you will be using it on Stygian Onlooker sometimes in the early game to just get an extra 4 damage in. This will actually be really common. But we do want to make sure Onto Dusk doesn't get bricked out. Obviously, you can always just draw if you have nothing. But the third Nocturne is pretty fine here, and I think with games going on a little bit longer, I'm happy about it. We do want to make sure our, you know, unit mana curve is good, and the single Callista, I think, is just not quite doing enough of anything between Merciless Hunter, which we're often going to be keeping in our opening hand now, and Frenzied Skitterer. We already have enough 3s, so I'll go for the third Nocturne instead of the Callista, although in this case it's close. I'm happy with one Harrowing as a way to be able to beat out, you know, some of the big late game blowout hands, as well as one Mark of the Isles and 2 Skrank Sands. So this is actually looking pretty good to me in terms of a full list. Feels like we have a good idea of exactly, you know, where our problems are and how to solve them. And it's playing at a pretty good speed. I like the speed that this is playing at now that we're not in Raz Bloodman anymore. Unfortunately, this card is just a little too slow. For a single card on turn 7, we really need to be able to get more of a reliable ability than this. The problem with Raz Bloodman, so here's an important deck building technique. Think about it in terms of the matchups that you're expecting, right? And like what we're playing this against, what we're effectively countering by doing this. Run the matchups in your head. So the matchups where Raz Bloodmane is effectively going to be best, when we have this turn 7 play where we're able to spend all of our mana on a single card, those are often going to be the matchups, you know, to that when we need Raz to close out the game. Those will be matchups that are really slow, like Targon, like Shadow Isles Freljord, like Ezreal Draven. And those are the same kinds of matchups that we don't really want to be spending our entire mana pool on a single card in, right? Because those are the control matchups. Those are the ones that will usually have a way to deal with them. A lot of the faster matchups end up being decided pretty much before turn 7. And the big problem with Raz Bloodmane, okay, so we have to ask, what are the matchups where he's good in? And those are a lot of the sort of like mid-range matchups, like Demacia style matchups without Targon, you know, like Fiora Shen or like Ashe kind of decks that Raz Bloodmane will really excel in. And as long as we're aware of that, in metas where we're seeing those kinds of decks a lot, I don't really mind him that much. But he is still going to be pretty awkward there because there's just like a lot of vulnerability in committing your entire mana pool on a single card. It's better to just double develop into your finishing turn, even if you want to develop. The reason for that is kind of weird, but think about it again in terms of open attacking versus developing on your attack turn. You really want to make sure that, so a weird rule of thumb is that if you're developing, you usually don't really give the opponent more of an opportunity by double developing, right? Like imagine they have, one of their Punisher cards, an Avalanche, a Rakdos Sentry, or whatever, especially in these later terms, you're not giving them more value by playing a second unit after you've played your first, right? You play your first unit into an attack, and this is giving the opponent an opportunity to respond. And that's all they need. They just need one opportunity. Giving them a second action after that doesn't really give them much additional value. And if their first action is a way of dealing with a single developed threat, which it often is, again, think of any sort of removal, any sort of stun is a way of dealing with a single threat. If their opportunity is that, then you want your development to not be one single big action development. So there's this weird rule of thumb, and obviously there's plenty of exceptions to this, but usually if you're developing, it's better to give your opponent multiple actions so that you can develop with multiple actions in a way that doesn't get punished by the opponent's single action that they'll have to counter you. Does that make sense? Right? Like Arachnoid Sentry and any sort of thing that's going to stun or kill your unit is going to really punish Raz Bloodmane. Like Tri-Beam that would just kill him and develop a blocker all at once. Well, if I at least play two actions, then I'm not giving a single Tri-Beam very much value, right? Because it's not at least able to shut down my entire mana pool while summoning a unit all at once. I am a little bit more safer, and I'm not giving up much more of an opportunity after the first action has been taken, okay? So that's the bigger problem with Raz Bloodmane here. Sorry that, I end up kind of like talking a lot about these things, but I really want to do these kinds of series for those of you guys that really want to learn about deck building. And of course, I know some of you guys are going to find it boring, but I mean, that's what Deck Doctor is all about. It's all about getting deep into the deck building theory that I'm known for. I mean, this is why, I get a lot of requests for this kind of stuff. Anyway, this is going to be our third and final game to close out this episode, and I'll see if I might want to make some changes after this. Like I said, I wouldn't recommend building a deck and changing it so rapidly. But in this case, Fearsome is an archetype that I know in and out. So we've got Kindred Swain. It's going to be a slow, stally matchup. And I don't know if they actually have any big answers to Harrowing. However, I don't know if I can keep it in my opening hand, even as a one-of. I really do want to be able to pressure early. Let's just go ahead and solo keep Merciless Hunter here. If I was very familiar with the matchup, there are some matchups that you can keep Harrowing in your opening hand for. But for the most part, it takes a matchup to be pretty dominant for that to happen. They need to have no pressure tools and no answer for a later Harrowing. Okay, and this is perfect. We're just getting some nice damage in here. His House Spider's not going to do much of anything at all. And we're looking to see if he's going to play something that gives our Hunter value. So this is actually pretty interesting. We really want to be playing this Stygian Onlooker in the going off turn. We can potentially, set up a Nightfall as well. I think the Merciless Hunter is fine to play here. It's a little bit awkward because, I'd really like to be able to save the Vulnerable Grant. But unfortunately, I really just can't send enough to spell mana since I really need to be putting pressure next turn. So I will just have to, give something pretty useless vulnerable. That's fine. There's nothing really wrong with playing Merciless Hunter as a 3-mana 4/3 Fearsome. Happens a lot, which is part of the reason Callista is redundant in this deck. Okay, and he's burning 1 mana. That's amazing for me. Alright, so we've got a few plays here. We can do Bakai into Stygian into Fading into Stygian and really start dishing out the damage there. Very vulnerable to Withering Wail, which honestly, it's Kindred Swain. I have no goddamn clue what Kindred Swain is running. They could be running Wail for all I know. Who knows? Could play Nocturne. A little bit vulnerable into something like an Arachnoid Sentry. I think I'm fine to develop wide here. Withering Wail would be kind of annoying, but depending on how he chooses to spend his mana here, I might not commit both Stygians. Let's go ahead and play one Stygian here. There's the Arachnoid Sentry, and now I can freely play the second Stygian if I want. Looks pretty fine. Okay. So we do have the ability to drag these pretty freely. His Arachnoid Sentry can block and kill my Bakai Reaper if the Bakai Reaper is attacking. I don't think there's that much of an issue with that. Let's go ahead and push for maximum damage here. Also expect a flock to kill our hunter, but that doesn't really matter that much. So this is a lot of damage. We can also force a slay so that our Bakai Reaper can attack. This is actually a bit of an interesting attack. I don't mind forcing this on the Stygian Onlooker, actually, as weird as that is, because he's pretty happy letting this all through. Actually, he kind of can't really survive at 5 health, huh? This takes him to 8 instead. It's gonna be 6. Yeah, I think it's a little bit unnecessarily vulnerable attacking with that. I'm just gonna go ahead and leave the Reaper back. I think this is fine, just because I expect him to have an answer to one of the onlookers anyway, so I don't think I'm really giving him that great of a position by not attacking with Bakai. In a similar board state, it's just kind of unnecessary to leave the Bakai back, but basically, I'm not 100% sure how much damage I'm going to be dealing here. I can't really go that aggressive because it's very possible for him to, you know, Vile Feast and stuff and just keep his health way too high. And if he does that, then blocks my Bakai Reaper, then I'm in trouble. So playing it a little bit safe here is warranted. Okay, so I can go ahead and Nocturne here. Kindred's really not going to threaten too much of anything. I think I'll be fine just, yeah, playing this first. I don't need to bank the mana. See what we get. There's an Onlooker. That's pretty nice. But Bakai Reaper curves this turn as well, and looks pretty terrifying. I think I do want to develop the 2 skitters into my attack turn, so that actually makes the Bakai Reaper a little bit better here, oddly enough. So again, keep in mind, we're just making sure we're planning everything out, right? So we can go ahead and give it a Kindred vulnerable. Of course, Nocturne is grant an enemy vulnerable, which is really nice because the Kindred can be dragged away without, you know, having to use one of our Fearsome units, which also allows one of our Bakai Reapers to grow. In this case, really no reason to block the Kindred. And this is why we went for the Bakai instead of the Stygian Onlooker, because we knew we have the turn 6 mana. We know we're going to double Skitterer on turn 6 and go for the kill. And we have no spells in this hand. We can't bank mana, so the Stygian Onlooker that doesn't have the ability to be played here isn't really as valuable. Here, this is totally fine. Kindred is always going to kill one of our units for free, but the fact that we have the ability to just play both of these Skitterers here and lock it out as a blocker, I think should give us a win. If he has a crazy hand, then we could be in a spot of trouble. But again, you know, keep in mind what we just talked about. We forced out the Arachnoid Sentry earlier. He kind of has to be playing these development punishers, and now I feel very good. And now if he's on an open attack punisher, like something like a Withering Wail, well, I'm devaluing that open attack punisher by developing in, because keep in mind those cards are balanced mana-wise around being able to lock out mana on an open attack for the other player. So we develop in again, and we're always just going to develop into our attack turns like that, and that's how we win the game. The one thing is, something like a very late game specific development punisher like Ruination isn't something we're going to be enabling on every street, but that's perfectly fine. We have plenty of ways to play around Ruination. I'm really not too worried about that as a card. I think people kind of like over worry about Ruination. As long as you're putting up good pressure in the early game and not making mistakes, it doesn't really punish you that much. Okay, so this ends up being the final version of my deck for this deck doctor. Again, this was a deck submitted by LoR Decks and Gameplay. Thanks for the idea, man. It's actually a lot of fun. I actually, honestly, am probably going to be messing around with more of this concept on my stream. You guys might see a highlight video if I end up playing it a lot more, and I might be refining it more. I think this is definitely quite a bit better than the version I started with, but if I end up playing it a lot more, I'm sure I'll make at least a couple of changes. I'm not 100% sure how I feel about Mark, Scrying Sand, and Mask Mother here. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed a little bit of insight into the deck building process. I really want to do kind of like a full deck building guide series, but it's really hard to kind of like script that and, you know, break everything down into efficient chapters. It's a lot easier to, at least for me, the way I work, it's a lot easier to just have these kinds of examples or kind of like miscellaneous tips where I'm able to kind of like talk about things more freeform, and hopefully you guys are able to learn quite a bit from this as well. All right, guys, hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time.